God bless Louisiana. God bless each and every one of you. And God bless the United States of America. What a pleasure to be back in New Orleans. How great to be back at the RLC. You know, tomorrow morning, a lot of us will see our pastors stand at the pulpit. And they'll go back to the original Greek in the scriptures. If you look at the Greek roots for the word politics, it has two parts. Poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites. Which is a fairly accurate description of Washington, D.C. I remember back in 2012, when I was running for the Senate, Heidi and I are blessed. We've got two little girls, Caroline and Catherine. And one Saturday morning, about 6:30 in the morning, I was doing a radio interview in our bedroom. And Caroline, who was 4 at the time, she jumped out of bed like she often does on Saturday morning. She came running into the bedroom, threw open the door to come play with Mommy and Daddy. And Heidi, my wife, she was still in bed at the time. She jumped up, ran over, grabbed Caroline, pulled her into the living room, said, "Sweetheart, not now. Daddy's doing a radio interview." Caroline crossed her arms, marched across the living room, said, "Politics, politics, politics. It's always politics." But you know what? We're here for something a lot more important than politics. The men and women who are here today, you're here because our country's in crisis. There is an urgency facing this country. There is an urgency in politics unlike anything we've ever seen. Over and over again, the most common thing I hear as I travel the country is men and women, they stop me, they put their hand on my shoulder, they look me in the eyes, and they say, "Ted, I'm scared. I'm scared for this country. We're losing our freedom. We're losing our constitutional rights. My children and grandchildren, we're bankrupting them. And they're not going to have the future and opportunity we've been blessed to have." Well, I'm here to tell you, in the face of that urgency, I am powerfully optimistic. Something incredible is happening. America is waking up. We are seeing revival. We are seeing renewal. And together, mark my words, we are going to turn this nation around. We need every one of us. We need every one of us together. Thank you. I want to tell you that we're winning. Media won't tell you that. I want to talk about how we win this fight, how we turn this nation around, how we restore liberty. And I want to talk about the past, the present, and the future. Let's start with the past. The last 2 years, we have seen something extraordinary. We have seen the rise of the grassroots, the power of the people. I remember the beginning of last year, the first significant fight we had in the Senate. I was proud to stand side by side with my friend Senator Rand Paul and his epic filibuster on drones. That was in April. That was actually the first time I'd ever spoken on the Senate floor. You know, there's a tradition in the Senate that freshmen are supposed to be seen and not heard. I haven't entirely managed to comply with that one. But when Rand stood up on that filibuster, when it started, I'll tell you, most of our colleagues had no idea what he was talking about. Most of our colleagues said, "What on earth are you doing?" And what happened was incredible. Twitter exploded. All across the country, men and women began looking and standing up and saying, "We want to protect our constitutional rights." During the filibuster, I went to the Senate floor and read actual tweets people had sent supporting Rand, which I have to admit as an aside makes me very, very happy. I'm pretty sure that's the first time that's ever happened on the Senate floor, which means 20 years from now, if there's a political Trivial Pursuit game, I'll be an obscure answer to that question. But my favorite tweet was a woman that I read on the Senate floor. She said, "I'm 73 years old. I'm a grandmother. I've never used Twitter before in my life, but I signed up today to stand with Rand." As the day went on and it became evening, a lot of our colleagues went home, they had dinner, maybe they went to bed, and suddenly their staff is on the phone urgently calling them saying, "You got to get back here." And we'd see colleagues of ours in the Senate, they'd show up discombobulated at the Senate floor, they'd say, the Tweety thing is happening. And as a result of the American people rising up, standing up, the next day, President Obama was forced to do what he had refused to do for 3 consecutive weeks, which is admit in writing the U.S. Constitution limits the authority of the federal government to target U.S. citizens. You look at the next major battle we had, the battle over guns, following the tragic shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. The president didn't do what he should have done. What he should have done is he should have stood up and said, "We're going to go after violent criminals, and we're going to come down on violent criminals like a ton of bricks." Instead, he uses it as an excuse to try to go after the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. And the conventional wisdom in Washington was that this was unstoppable. You'd have Democrats going on the Sunday shows saying, "This is the sweet spot, regulating the Second Amendment rights of our citizens." Well, Texas, like Louisiana, we define gun control real simple. That's hitting what you aim at. And so 3 of us, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and myself, sent a very short and sweet note to Harry Reid that we said we will filibuster any legislation that undermines the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And what happened is exactly what just happened here, which is what that moment did is it slowed things down for a moment, it shined a light for a moment, and it gave an opportunity for the American people to start standing up. For the American people to start standing up, to start lighting up the phones, to start when their senators came home to their states, you'd go to a town hall meeting and the constituents would say, "How come you're not fighting for the Second Amendment?" And the American people rose up in overwhelming numbers. And what happened when it came time to a vote, every single proposal of the president's to undermine the Second Amendment was voted down on the Senate floor. Thank you. Look, what won that, and this is the central point. Nobody cares what any politician in Washington says. Power in politics, sovereignty in America is with we the people. And that is the path to turning this country around, empowering the people. A third example in the past, dealing with foreign affairs. A couple of months ago, you'll recall we had a Russia sanctions bill and a Ukraine bill that the administration tried to add to it provisions that were so-called reforms of the International Monetary Fund. These are provisions that President Obama had been pushing for years. What they would have done is dramatically increase the exposure of U.S. taxpayers by billions of dollars to the IMF. They would have decreased America's influence at the IMF. And most absurdly, they would have increased Russia's influence at the IMF. And yet the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed it. I stood up and objected, said under no circumstances are we going to undermine America's influence in an international body. The response was typical Washington, where Democrats and Republicans began excoriating those of us standing up to stop this. Began standing on the floor going, what is wrong with you people? You're tilting at windmills. This is impossible. You ever heard that before? Yes. Standing for conservative principle, it's impossible. It cannot happen. Just abandon hope. So on the Senate floor, Republican colleagues went on and on about how unreasonable I was being. 1 week later, Harry Reid and Barack Obama dropped the provision entirely and stripped it out of the bill. A week after it was impossible, it happened, and then it passed 98-2. One more example. Y'all will remember a couple of months ago when the nation of Iran named as its ambassador to the United Nations Hamid Abu-Dhabi, a known terrorist, a man who participated in holding 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. Now, that was intended to be and was, in fact, a slap in the face to America. In response, I introduced legislation in the Senate to bar Abu-Dhabi and any other known terrorist from coming into the United States. That legislation passed the United States Senate 100-0. We had senators on the Senate floor as varied as Lindsey Graham and Chuck Schumer singing its praises. I told Schumer afterwards, be careful, Chuck, I think lightning's going to strike you. It then went to the House of Representatives. It passed the House of Representatives 435-0. And then President Obama signed it into law. A couple of weeks ago at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, President Obama was up there joking about it. He said, so Ted Cruz introduced legislation that I signed. He said, here's a picture of the signing ceremony, and he put up on the screen a picture of him, a picture of me, and a picture of the devil with hell freezing over. We are winning these fights over and over and over again. Amen. That's the past. Let's talk about the present. Present is 2014. Let me tell you right now, I am convinced we are going to retake the United States Senate in 2014. And thanks to the hard work of a lot of men and women in this room, we're going to retire Mary Landrieu from politics. And even more importantly, we're going to retire Harry Reid as Majority Leader. Now, let me ask a question that very few people in Washington ever seem to ask, which is why? Why have the numbers turned so dramatically? Why are so many Democrats running terrified? And I'll tell you, the most compelling reason is one single word. It begins with an O and ends with Obamacare. And I want to point to the fight that so many of us engaged in last fall and last summer to stop the abomination, to stop the disaster that is Obamacare. Now, if you listen to the Democrats, if you listen to the media, although I repeat myself, they will tell you that fight last fall accomplished nothing. They will tell you that everyone's efforts standing up to Obamacare did not succeed. Really? You know, any wartime general will tell you that not every war is won in a single battle. What we did collectively last summer and last fall is we elevated the national debate all over this country about the disaster that is Obamacare. Millions of Americans lit up the phones to Washington, D.C. Midway through, one of my colleagues literally made a fist, pounded the table, and said, "My constituents keep calling me." And a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. As a result of that fight, people suddenly connected. Millions of people losing their jobs, millions of people being forced into part-time work, millions of people losing their health insurance, millions of people facing skyrocketing premiums. They connected it all back to Obamacare that was sold under false pretenses. And somehow all of the graybeards in Washington who opposed fighting against Obamacare are now looking around, and we're winning Senate seats all over the country. They're reaping the fruits of the battle, which is perfectly fine, but we need to take a moment to acknowledge the lesson of the battle. How do you win elections? You don't win it by standing for nothing. And that leads to the third thing I want to talk about: the future. How do we win elections? How do we turn this country around? How do we pull back from the cliff? And what I'm going to tell you is we do the same thing that is working right now. That's right. You know, there's an odd dynamic in Washington. There's this cluster of political consultants. They keep running losing political campaigns, making the same mistakes, and they keep coming back to Republican donors saying, "Give us money to do the same failed thing that didn't work last time or the time before, and let us make those mistakes again." You know, if I was coming to you trying to start a small business, if I said to you, "Listen, you've invested in 4 of my previous businesses. Every one of them went bankrupt. I've got a great plan for business number 5. I'm going to do the exact same thing over again." My guess is you might not invest in business number 5. We understand the urgency. The urgency means we've got to do what works, and the way you win elections is you stand for principle and you empower the people. We need to stand for liberty. We need to stand for the Bill of Rights. All of the Bill of Rights. We need to stand for the First Amendment. You've got the IRS asking citizen groups, "Tell us what books you're reading. Tell us the content of your prayers." Let me tell you something. The federal government has no business asking any American the content of our prayers. We need to stand up and defend the Second Amendment. You know, Vice President Joe Biden, you know the nice thing about that? You don't need a punchline. I promise you, try it. The next time you're at a party, just walk up to someone and say, "Vice President Joe Biden." Just close your mouth. They will laugh. It works. But Vice President Biden said, if anyone attacks your house, just go outside with a double-barreled shotgun and fire both barrels in the air. Now that is very, very good advice. If it so happens you're being attacked by a flock of geese. You look at the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our right to privacy. How many of y'all have your cell phones here today? Let me ask you, please leave your cell phones on. I want to make sure President Obama hears every word we have to say today. You look at the 10th Amendment, or as the Obama administration calls it, the what? You look at the explosion of federal government power intruding the authority of the states, intruding the authority of the people, doing things the federal government has no business doing. For example, we need to repeal every word of Common Core. We have a common core in this country. It's called the Constitution of the United States. And education is far too important to be run out of Washington. It needs to be at the state level or even better, the local level. We need to empower parents. Just when you think the assault on our liberty can't get worse, Democrats in Congress have promised this year we are going to vote on their proposal to repeal the First Amendment. I promise you I'm not making this up. 41 Democrats have signed on to a constitutional amendment that Chuck Schumer has promised we're going to vote on this year that would give Congress plenary authority to regulate political speech. They've decided that the rise of the grassroots really is scaring the living daylights out of them. And there are politicians who really don't like it when the pesky voters express their views and exercise their sovereignty. It's interesting, this amendment explicitly says nothing in this proposed amendment will undermine the freedom of the press. So the New York Times is protected. You and me are not. If this amendment passed, Congress would have the authority to tell the NRA you cannot distribute voter guides telling people how politicians are voting on the Second Amendment. If this amendment passed, Congress would have the authority to tell the Sierra Club you can't run any ads talking about a candidate's environmental record. If this amendment were to pass, Congress would have the authority to tell Right to Life or Planned Parenthood, either one of them, you can't talk about your views. If this amendment passed, Congress would have the authority to criminalize bloggers, to criminalize movie makers. You notice they keep indicting filmmakers? Funny how that happens. Our country was built on the proposition that unlimited power in government is always, always, always inimical to liberty. The First Amendment protects our fundamental rights, and we need to stand for liberty against the efforts of politicians in Washington to strip the constitutional rights of Americans. We need to stand for growth and opportunity. If you look at the Obama economic agenda, you know, if you sat down and tried to design an agenda to hammer the living daylights out of young people, you couldn't come up with a better agenda than the Obama economic agenda. For 5 years, we've been trapped in the great stagnation. From 2008 to 2012, our economy grew 0.9% a year. And you know who's hurt the most by that? Hardworking Americans. Young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms. You know, I try to look at these issues from the perspective of my dad. Many of you all know my father. 57 years ago, my dad fled Cuba with nothing. He'd been imprisoned, he'd been tortured, and he fled Batista, coming to America seeking freedom. He had $100 sewn into his underwear. I actually don't advise carrying money in your underwear. And he washed dishes. He made 50 cents an hour to pay his way through school to go on to start a small business to work towards the American dream. Now, my dad has been my hero my whole life. But I'll tell you what I find most extraordinary about him and his story is how commonplace it is. Every one of us together as Americans, we are the children of those who risked everything for freedom. People are hurting because of the failed Obama economic agenda. I was in Nebraska a few weeks ago. Big rally, over 1,000 people in North Platte, Nebraska. A woman came up to me, hugged my neck. She said, "Ted, I've got 6 kids at home. I'm a single mom because my husband left me and he's not paying child support." She said, "I'm working 5 jobs right now. All of them are under 30 hours a week because of Obamacare. And I go from one job to the next, and I'm having a hard time keeping food on the table, keeping clothes on my kids' backs, and I never get to see my kids because I go from one job to another to another." That's who we're fighting for. If my dad were still washing dishes today, the odds are very high he would have lost his job because of $1.7 trillion in new taxes, because of crushing regulations, and the people that are getting laid off are the teenage immigrants washing dishes. And if he were lucky enough to keep his job, the odds are overwhelming he would have had his hours forcibly reduced to 28, 29 hours a week because the threshold for Obamacare is 30. And you can't feed your kids, you can't pay your way through college, you can't achieve the American dream on 28 hours a week. The final thing we need to do to turn things around is empower the people. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. And I told you at the beginning how powerfully, how profoundly optimistic I am. I'm optimistic in large part because I think where we are today is uncannily, is eerily like the late 1970s. Late 1970s, we had Jimmy Carter in the White House. We had the same failed economic policies, out of control spending and taxes and regulation, the same misery, the same malaise. We had the same feckless and naive foreign policy, making the world a much, much more dangerous place. By the way, if there's one person on earth thrilled about the job President Obama is doing, it's Jimmy Carter. And it reveals a lot that you don't have to explain why. Everybody knows exactly why Carter's very happy at what's happening. But y'all will remember what happened in 1980. We saw a grassroots movement, millions of men and women across this country rise up and become the Reagan Revolution. It didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. And as an aside, if you have a candidate who Washington adores, run and hide. But the American people rose up and they said, there's a better way. We want to get back to the principles that built this country, to the free market principles, to the constitutional liberties. And the reason I'm optimistic, the reason I am so hopeful, is the same thing is happening again. Everywhere I go, across the country, you see men and women waking up, men and women who hadn't been involved in politics, who'd been going to work, had been going to church, had been raising their kids. They look up and say, what is happening to our nation? The same thing is happening. I'll tell you, it inspires me. All right, I want to do two final things to wrap up. Number one, all of y'all who pulled out your phones, when I ask you to take your phones out again, if we're going to turn this country around, it is going to be because we mobilize and energize a grassroots army. And if you're willing to be part of that army, part of communicating the free market principles, the constitutional liberties this country was built on, I'm going to ask you to text the word growth to 33733. Let me say that again. The number is 33733. And text the word growth. The only way we turn this country around is the influence each and every one of you has on your friends, on your neighbors, on your family, reaching out and being a voice that the path we're on isn't working, and we can get back to a better way. The last thing I want to do is, with apologies to Barack Obama, I want to ask y'all a few questions. Can we retake the U.S. Senate? Yes, we can. Can we retire Mary Landrieu? Can we retire Harry Reid? Can we restore the Constitution? And can we repeal every word of Obamacare? That, my friends, is change we can believe in. Thank you, and God bless you.